Hey Goblin, you've been really practicing those war drums.
I'll bring the generic goblin noise!
This video is sponsored by Cool Stuff Inc. If you're looking for cards in the US, look no further as you can use the promo code MTGMudsta to get you 5% off anything on the site. Or if you're in Canada like me, you can use the same promo code at Multizone to get 10% off your orders of singles. If cards aren't what you're looking for, Original Magic Art has playmats, tokens, and sweet art that you can use that same promo code to help you get 5% off your order there. And if you just want to help out the channel, you can always consider becoming a patron for as little as $1 a month and join the generic Goblin Gang. Hey gang, and welcome back. Today's game is a special one because not only was it filmed at the Face Tour 2021 Montreal location, it also features Madison from the Spike Feeders and Colin from Cardboard Command. I've also been approached by an editor by the name of Chris, who runs his own YouTube channel because he wanted to try his hand at editing EDH games and adding some sweet effects. I'd be curious to hear what you think about it, so be sure to leave a comment about what you like in the comments below. I am playing my Kolvori God of Kinship deck, keeping Hammer of Nazan, Gilnra, Collar of Wirewood, Forest, Tranquil Thicket, Each-Tick Savage Spicer, Instrument of the Bards, and Numa Draga Chieftain. Madison is playing her budget-friendly Elenda the Dusk Rose, keeping Orzhov Basilica, Plains, Swamp, Prismatic Lens, Blood Pact, Liquid Metal Torque, and Fracture. Hanging out in the command zone was James, playing his Kodama of the East Tree and Tymna the Weaver deck, keeping Command Tower, Elvish Reclaimer, Swamp, Sun Petal, Obnixilis the Fallen, Emeria Angel, and Roiling Regrowth. Last but not least, Colin is playing Shirei, Shizo's Caretaker, keeping a Bolas' Citadel, Bottle Gnomes, Serrated Scorpion, Panharmonicon, and 3 Swamps. I win the die roll and start us off. I play a tapped Tranquil Thicket, passing. Madison plays a Plains, and passes. James plays a Sunpetal Grove tapped, and passes. Colin plays a Swamp, and then casts a Serrated Scorpion, and passes. I draw and play a Forest. I then cast an Instrument of the Bards, and pass. Madison draws and plays a Swamp. She taps 2 for a Reassembling Skeleton, passing to James. James plays a Command Tower, and casts an Elvish Reclaimer. Colin has a Swamp for turn, and he moves to combat, swinging the Scorpion at me for 1, and passes. My Instrument of Bards gets a counter on my upkeep, and I draw. Sadly, I miss a land drop, and pass to Madison. Madison plays a Liquid Metal Torque in her main phase, and then plays an Orzhov Basilica, bouncing the Swamp back to her hand. She then moves to combat, swinging 1 at Colin, and passes turn. James draws, and plays a Swamp. He then sacrifices the Swamp as he casts a Roiling Regrowth, and grows to find a Plains and a Forest from the spell. Colin plays a Swamp in his main phase, and casts an Unstable Obelisk. He swings a Serrated Scorpion at Madison for 1, and passes. My Instrument of Bards gets another counter on my upkeep, and I then draw for turn. I play an Orin Reef the Vastwood, tapped, and pass to Madison. Madison draws and replays the Swamp she'd bounced back to her hand the turn before, and then casts Elenda. She chooses Violence and swings at me for 1 and ships the turn. James draws and casts an Emeria Angel in his main phase. He plays a Fabled Passage, getting a landfall trigger from the Angel and makes a bird token. He then sacrifices the land, going to find another land, and gets to make another bird token, and passes to Colin. Colin casts a Mindless Automaton in his main phase, and with nothing else, passes to me. I get to put another counter on my instrument, and then draw for turn. I then cast Gilnra, Collar of Wirewood, and pass to Madison. Madison draws and plays a Swamp. Moving to combat, she swings a Skeleton at James, who blocks the Emeria Angel. Elenda gets a counter from the Skeleton dying, and Madison passes. James draws and casts an Obnixilis the Fallen, and then plays a Polluted Delta, cracking it and losing 1. He decides to have both landfall triggers go at Colin, and Colin drops to 33. James also gets to make 2 more bird tokens as a result of the Emeria Angel and the landfall triggers. The Delta ends up finding him at an Adatha Triome, and James then moves to combat. He swings the Emeria Angel at Madison and the 2 birds at me, which we both take. With nothing more, he passes turn. Colin draws and casts Culling the Weak, sacrificing his Scorpion for 4 black mana. This has everyone taking 2, and Colin uses the mana to cast his commander, Shirei. He then removes 2 counters from the Automaton to draw a card. This has the Automaton dying, and he gets a Shirei trigger later on, and Colin then casts a Walk the Plank on Obnixilis, and once that's done, moves to his end step, bringing back the Automaton with Shirei. I get a counter on my instrument before I draw. I then play a sad Temple of the False God and cast an Abundance. With nothing else, I pass, and at the end of turn, Madison casts Blood Pact targeting herself, losing 2 and drawing 2, and then goes to her turn. Colin also decides to remove 2 more counters from the automaton, which dies and then comes back at my end step thanks to Shirei. Madison draws and plays a Plains. She then casts a Dimir House Guard. Moving to combat, she swings Elenda at James for 8, which he chumps, and this has her gaining 8 life from the lifelink on her commander. Moving to her second main phase, Colin removes more counters from the automaton, drawing a card, and then brings it back at the end of turn. James draws and casts one of his commanders, Kodama of the East Tree. He then plays a Bloodstained Mire and gets some triggers, but Madison responds by casting Fracture on Kodama. She had meant to tap the Liquid Metal Torque beforehand to make it into an artifact to do it, since Fracture can't actually hit creatures, but we do catch that later on. James then cracks the Mire for a swamp and gets 2 bird tokens off the landfall triggers, and then announces he'll pass through phases to his end step. This has Colin using the automaton loop again to draw and gets it back at the end of turn. Colin draws and plays a swamp. He casts Soul Channeling on Shirei and then removes counters from his automaton to draw a card, getting it back at the end of turn. I get a counter on my instrument and choose Land for Abundance, flipping into a Llanowar Reborn. I then play that land and cast a Hammer of Nazan. I then equip it onto Gillenra. Colin once more does his automaton loop before my end step, and I pass. Madison draws and swings Elenda at James once more. He chumps again with a bird, and Madison gains 11 this time. She then casts a Disciple of Bolus, sacrificing her commander to gain 11, and draw 11 cards, not to mention make 11 1/1 vampire tokens. She then casts an Everflowing Chalice, kick twice, and a Corpse Knight before moving to discard while Colin once more loops his automaton. James draws and plays a Woodland Cemetery, and then recasts Kodama. He gets to make a bird from the landfall trigger thanks to playing a land, and then passes while Colin continues to play with himself in the automaton. Colin draws and plays a Reliquary Tower. He then casts a Bottle Gnomes, and then an Ayara, First of Locthwain. This has everyone getting drained for Ayara by 1 as it comes in. He then sacrifices the Bottle Gnomes and removes the counters from his automaton again, gaining 3 and drawing a card, and then passes, bringing them back. I get a counter on my instrument and choose Land off Abundance, hitting a Field of Ruin. I play it for turn, and then activate Instrument of Bards, revealing Vorinclex, Monstrous Raider. The instrument makes a treasure token, which I then use to help cast Renata, Called to the Hunt, before passing to Colin, who before letting me move to my end step, sacrifices his gnomes and removes the counters on the automaton to gain 3 and draw a card, and then bring them back thanks to Shirei. Madison draws and plays an Ash Barrens. She recasts Elenda, and Colin responds by doing his loop now to stop her from getting counters. She also casts a Viscera Seer, and all of her opponents lose 2 from the Corpse Knight. Madison then moves to combat and swings the House Guard at James for 2, and then passes, with Colin doing his loops again at the end of turn. James draws and plays a Retreat to Hagra. He then activates the Elvish Reclaimer, sacrificing a swamp, to go and grab a Golgari Rot Farm in an attempt to go infinite with Kodama. I respond to this by casting Force of Vigor and exiling Numara to destroy the Retreat to Hagra and Colin's Unstable Obelisk. James is still able to make infinite bird tokens, which does let him put all lands from his hand into play. He then cracks the Flooded Strand, dropping a 30, and follows up by casting a Tymna the Weaver. Moving to combat, he swings the Emeria Angel at me and 2 birds apiece at Colin and Madison. We all take our hits, and James then loses 2 and draws 2 cards thanks to Tymna's post-combat trigger. And before moving to the end step, Colin once more sacrifices his gnomes and removes the counters from the automaton to gain 3 and draw a card. Colin draws and plays a swamp, and then casts Bolus's Citadel. He sacrifices the automaton to draw a card, and then pays some life to cast Blood Pet off the top, draining the table for 1 thanks to Ayara. Colin then sacrifices the Blood Pet to Ayara to draw a card, and then casts a Charcoal Diamond off the top, losing 2. Colin then does his loop again, draining the table for 1 off of Ayara, and gaining 3 off the Bottle Gnomes, and then pass his turn. In my upkeep, I get a counter on the instrument, and choose Lands for Abundance, and get a Forest. I then play the Forest, and cast Vorinclex, moving the Graph counter from Llanowar Reborn to it, and then activating Oran Reef. Renata also gives a +1/+1 counter as well, and since they're all doubled, Vorinclex actually gets 6 +1/+1 counters. I then move through my phases, and Colin loops his stuff, gaining 3 and drawing a card. Elenda actually doesn't gain any counters as a result of Vorinclex being out, but we do get drained from the Blood Pet re-entering on Colin's side and Ayara seeing it. Madison draws, and plays a Falcon Wrath Noble, and then casts a Grey Merchant of Asphodel. Gary then drains the table for 8, and Corpse Knight deals 2 to everyone, and Madison gains 24. She then sacrifices her 11 Vampire tokens to drain James for another 11, and scry 1 11 times. She then sacrifices the Grey Merchant, Dimir Houseguard, Disciple of Volus, and Elenda, draining him for 3, and then everyone loses 4 as 4 Vampire tokens come in from Elenda, and the Knight sees them, and this has the benefit of taking James out. She then says she'll move to her end step, and once more Colin loops his stuff to gain another 3, and drains everyone for 1 from Ayara and the Blood Pet. Madison also gets to drain him from the Falcon Wrath Noble triggers, so he actually only gains 2 life overall. Colin casts a Fume Spitter off the Bolas' Citadel, and drains the table for 1 and loses 1. He then casts a Demonic Tutor from his hand, and once he's done shuffling, plays a Swamp off the top of his library. He then casts a Priest of the Forgotten Gods from the Citadel, losing 2 and draining the table. Colin then follows up with a Flesh Eater Imp from hand, and then Swiftfoot Boots, equipping them to the Imp. Moving to combat, he swings the Imp at Madison, sacrificing his Blood Pet and Fume Spitter, as well as the Bottle Gnomes, to the Imp's ability. And Madison has the Falcon Wrath Noble keep draining him to keep his life total even. Moving to combat, he then swings the Imp at Madison, who only takes 2 Infect thanks to Vorinclex, cutting the Infect counters by half. With nothing else, Colin moves to his end step, bringing back his stuff, and this time draining the table for 3. On my upkeep, I take up the instrument and choose non-land of Abundance to get Reki History of Kamigawa and draw it. I cast Reki, and then equip the Hammer to Vorinclex. I move to my end step, and Colin does his loop again, draining us each for 3, although Madison's Falcon Wrath Noble makes him break even, but he does gain 2 extra life from the Bottle Gnomes. Madison draws, and plays a tapped Orzhov Guildgate. She then casts Elenda again, and the Corpse Knight trigger takes me out and pings Colin for 1. Moving to her end step, Colin sacrifices a Fume Spitter to get a -1/-1 counter onto the Noble, and then brings it back at the end of turn, draining Madison for 1 by Ayara. Colin draws, and sacrifices the Fume Spitter to kill the Noble. Madison responds, sacrificing it to the Viscera Seer to scry 1, and Colin gets drained for 2 overall. Colin then pays 3 life to cast Soul Shatter off the top, and Madison is forced to sacrifice Elenda, making 3 Vampire tokens, and dealing 3 to Colin thanks to the Corpse Knight seeing them come in. Colin then pays 5 life for a Sadistic Hypnotist off the top, and then another 5 life for a Phyrexian Plague Lord off the top thanks to the Bolas' Citadel. Colin then casts a Smothering Abomination from his hand, and Madison has been drained for a total of 3. Moving to combat, he sacrifices 7 creatures to pump the Imp by +7/+7, and swings for Lethal Infect on Madison, winning the game. So this game was a bit on the lower powered side. I think we all played decks that weren't particularly strong, and I was really happy to see a Shirei deck after so long. The last time I saw this commander was probably back in New Jersey when Pat was playing it, and I really love commanders that force you to be restrictive with how you build it. Being forced to only have 1 power creatures really makes the deck shine because you have to make some odd choices and get to see some cool cards in action. I'm still struggling with my Kolvori deck, and I'm not entirely sure I really enjoy mono-green legendaries. I think Reki is probably a better commander, but I'll probably take the deck apart either way. I think of everyone at the table, James's Kodama and Tymna deck was probably the strongest, although it was built around landfall. He did get pretty scary, but it seemed like everyone had the right answer at the right time, which helped keep him in check. Madison's Elenda the Dusk Rose deck was a great Aristocrats deck, and I'm surprised I don't see her more. Being able to continually generate tokens as things die is exactly what an Aristocrats deck wants to do, so Elenda really feeds into that well. Plus, it builds her up to be able to swing for lethal amounts of commander damage, so it just seems like a win-win. This video wouldn't be possible without the help from my sponsors, Cool Stuff Inc., Multizone, Original Magic Art, and Alter Sleeves. But it definitely wouldn't be possible without the help from you, the viewers, and my patrons. So I just want to say thank you for watching, and to remember, friends are just opponents you haven't eliminated yet.